so that each sub-part of the organization can be as nearly independent of its activities as possible. So we have fire departments and police departments and all those other good things. And there's, of course, much more interaction and coordination within each of these units than between units in a well-designed organization. High rates of rapid communication are maintained among activities that are highly independent, much less frequent communication among the activities that can be carried on in near independence. We call systems like this nearly decomposable. A second component of organizational design, maybe I should say of good organizational design, are the special contracts between the organization and its participants. Employment contracts with those who work in it, stock and bond ownership contracts with those who contribute capital, sales contracts with suppliers and customers. A key feature of organizations, of course, is the employment contract, which buys the employee's efforts during working hours so they can be applied to the organization's goals. Now, of course, economic motives play an important role in securing employee acceptance of employment. Most of us don't turn back our salaries to the university even during fund draw time, or at least not all of our salaries. So economic motives are present, but far more is involved. Once installed in the organization, the employee is surrounded by information and influences quite different from those that would surround him or her in another setting, inducing in the employee thereby strong identification. Not only motivational, I love the organization, but also cognitive, with the organization and its goals. It's this mechanism of organizational identification, the change that takes place in each one of us when we become the employee of an organization, as we learn the environment and the culture of that organization. That process of identification was, as far as I'm aware, really missed by Adam Smith when he concluded that large organizations could not be efficient, and perhaps was the major reason for his error. Organizational identification is a powerful motivation rooted both in people's values and in their need to build a simplified model of the world, there's that bounded rationality again, that focuses upon their particular responsibilities and their particular work environment. It's distinct from the self-interest, which of course also plays an important part in organizational behavior. It's organizational identification that gives organizations more than anything else their remarkable power to secure coordinated behavior of large numbers of people to accomplish organizational goals, thereby playing the major role they've played in the last 2 centuries in the rise of modern organizations. It also, by the way, regrettably causes human beings identified with particular groups to commit terrible atrocities against human beings in other groups. And one of the things as political scientists we might want to focus on in a broader way than we have in the past is not organizational identification over here, ethnic identification over here, some other kind of identification over here, but to see what role this plays in human affairs generally and what changes have to take place before it ceases to have all of these regrettable consequences as well as its good ones. Now, I think we need to pay special attention to innovation and adaptation to change. The interest in recent years of many sciences in complexity, complex systems, I'm sure you hear those words every day these days, has drawn attention to the fact that most of the complex systems seen in the world are what I earlier called nearly decomposable systems. They're arranged in levels, the elements at each lower level being subdivisions of the elements at the level above. They're hierarchies, not just authority hierarchies, but hierarchies in terms of division of the work. And each lower level is a subdivision of the elements above. So molecules of atoms, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, why is this principle of organization so universal in human society and organic nature and inorganic nature? The answer has 2 parts. The first I've really already discussed. Near decomposability is a means of securing the benefits of coordination while holding down its costs. So if we design complex systems to operate efficiently, we must divide them with their components as cleanly separated, which doesn't mean perfectly separated, as possible. But most of the complex systems we see in nature weren't designed, or at least most of us, the non-creationists among us, think they were not designed. They evolved through the processes of natural selection. But in evolution, there is a different but closely related reason why near decomposability prevails. In an environment of evolutionary change and natural selection, nearly decomposable systems, which have these parts with near independence, will adapt to the changing environment and gain in fitness more rapidly than systems without this property. I don't want to go into, there's quite a technical theory developing today on this topic. I don't want to go into it, but an example or two will indicate why. Let's suppose, forget evolution for a moment, let's suppose we were designing a human body. And of course, it's a big job, so we have specialized designers. Somebody's designing the heart, somebody's designing the liver, somebody's designing the lungs, etc. Now, if, subject to proper relation of scale, the heart's got to pump the right amount of blood and so forth, the lungs have to deliver the right amount of air. Subject to scale effects, if you can design a heart kind of independently of knowing how the lungs are going to come out or how the liver is going to come out, you have a far easier job than if you now have to look over the shoulder of the liver designer and the heart designer when you're designing the lungs or any of those orders. And one can show that the rates of change, especially in a changing environment, of a system that has to solve the problem of adaptive change, the rates of success in doing that are vastly different depending on the degree of dependence of the design of the individual parts, the amount of coordination of design you need in those parts. So if complex systems must operate in a constantly changing environment, and that certainly describes most of the environments we're interested in, they must modify their structures at a corresponding pace, and that means that, again, we have to limit what we can pay for coordination in design itself. We have to, as nearly as possible, find the components of these systems that can evolve, each one of them, semi-independently. Now, that might suggest that then, in a rapidly changing environment, organizations are a losing proposition and we'd better go back to markets. But of course, near decomposability affects the growth potential of markets as it does the potential of organizations. Because as I pointed out, markets really make use of much more information than just the immediate exchange of prices at the time of the trade. And the reason they can use that other information without burdening the communication system is because it's rather stable information. The Athenians knew that if they sent a ship up to the Black Seas, they'd find some wheat up at the end, and they knew roughly what it cost to raise wheat up there. No problem. In the light of all of these considerations, we might read the history of the past 200 years of industrializing societies as showing that with our increasing skills in building large organizations, our understanding of what these structural principles are that make it possible to build large groups of people who cooperate and collaborate with each other, who coordinate with each other, with our increasing skills in building large organizations that achieve high levels of coordination while maintaining a sufficient approximation to near decomposability of their components, we've enlarged greatly the area within which organizations are more effective than markets. That's the lesson of the 200 years since Smith and probably some periods before that. And this conclusion applies to governmental as well as to business organizations because both have followed similar paths in the development of their designs. You can read a textbook on public administration and learn a lot about how to organize a business and vice versa. Now, let me, in the remainder of my time, turn from these rather abstract and high-level pictures of social organization and ask why it matters. I'm going to focus on two issues which I think have always been central to us, deep in our hearts as political scientists. First, the distribution of power in modern society, and second, the distribution of the social product. Some people might say that's what political science is all about. Lasswell had slightly different words from that, but those are certainly the substance of his words. Now, the picture that my particular crystal ball displays is still a pretty fuzzy picture and pretty abstract, but it does refer to matters that are very practical concern to all of us individually and collectively. First, the distribution of power. Lord Acton said it very well, and I don't think I can improve on him. Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. A central problem, I won't say the, that implies we don't have other problems. A central problem in democratic institutions at all times, in all places, has been and is to create a broad distribution of power and to keep that distribution in stable equilibrium, because that doesn't collapse again. A basic tenet of democratic theory is that self-interest is such a strong motive that no single fraction of a society can be safely entrusted with the freedom and welfare of others who don't participate in the decision process. That's sort of the minimal assumption, you might say, of the founding fathers. During the 20th century, 2 massive experiments were carried out, and numerous smaller ones, to determine whether major changes in political and economic institutions could produce the, quote, new person, and the new institutions required to realize basic human goals within a highly centralized system of power. Of course, a centralization that was supposed to melt away at some time, but didn't quite. It's now widely agreed that the new institutions didn't work well, and particularly that the new person didn't appear. The personal motives that emerged in Soviet Russia and in Maoist China appear to be no less selfish or more virtuous than the motives of people in other parts of the world. In fact, from my contact with China and much less contact with Russia, these motives were discouragingly familiar. Among neoclassical economists, the outcome of these experiments was at first widely interpreted as a clear vindication of markets as the bulwark of freedom and productivity. But the years since the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the complex developments in an industrializing China have shown that matters are not so simple. As to Russia, it has become painfully clear that the introduction of markets without introducing viable and effectively managed organizations simply did not work, and that equally required was a stable equilibrium of diffused power, which also has not been put into place. In China, the situation is a little bit more complex, perhaps, but there remain in China, of course, great centralization of power and substantial constraints on the operations of markets, as well as equally evident deficiencies in organizational skills, as any of you who have spent 1 hour in a Chinese factory would recognize, and as the Chinese recognize. And the decentralization of power has as yet been steadfastly resisted. Nothing that we've seen in these 2 histories challenges the thesis that diffusion of power requires, in addition to markets, a multiplicity of effective organizations to perform a society's productive and service tasks. In fact, one might argue that the most important role of markets in a modern society is the role of helping to diffuse power by providing a way of holding organizations through competition to the tasks of providing efficiently the things demanded by the markets, thus preventing organizations from using their resources as power bases for extending their social influence and control. And many of the founding fathers of laissez-faire economics, modern founding fathers, Frank Knight, Henry Simons, and others, put great stress on that a major function of markets was to enforce competition for the particular reason that firms that are competing have to attend to the market's demands and the market's goals and can't invent social goals of their own. A multiplicity of organizations competing vigorously in markets is a strong protection against diversion of resources, either by profit or non-profit organizations. I'm talking about government organizations as well as business ones,